I'm delighted to be welcoming Divine Fuh to give our next presentation. Divine is an Associate Professor of Social Anthropology at the University of Cape Town and Director of HUMA, the Institute for the Humanities in Africa at the University of Cape Town. So please join me in welcoming Divine.
Thank you, David, for the introduction. And thank you, Anne, for inviting, and colleagues of AFOX. It's good to finally meet some people in person. I think COVID created lots of avatars, and it's been good to add flesh to those avatars, you know. So thank you. I was telling David that I tried very hard to say no, but it was very difficult, you know, and unlike often happens, you know, somehow the British Home Office decided to give me a visa, you know, so I don't know what happened there, but it does seem that when you drop the name AFOX, something happens, you know. Yeah, so really, I'm glad to be here. Thank you for the opportunity. When I looked at the program, I was asking myself, you know, why should I be in this discussion? Why should I be in this panel, you know? Because there was so much talk about SDGs and about entrepreneurship and about climate, about nature. And I was really asking, how do I do this, you know? And I had already submitted my theme, you know, about decolonial personhood, you know, and the new imaginaries of on-being. And I thought maybe I will be out of touch, you know. But I'm based at the University of Cape Town, the Institute for Humanities in Africa. We like to say that we are very interested in the question of being human and being human in the world, particularly being human in Africa and being African in the world, and what it means to be introducing an Africa-centered perspective, you know, to humanity. And one of the frameworks that we try to apply, I like to say we pretend to apply, is decoloniality. And with decoloniality, we have favored the question of epistemic disobedience. And we like to work with disobedience and asking ourselves what it means to disobey and whether it's possible to disobey. So this is something that really occupies us. And if you come to the Institute, we pretend to do that work because you have to work with something, you know. And I don't think we should spend too much time talking about decoloniality because I think it is the buzzword now. I like to call it chat GPTism now because it has become a concept that you can just drop and stir and you can do anything and just say decoloniality and everything is possible. So I'm not going to spend so much time talking about that. But really, I think Mignolo has appointed that decoloniality is a process and it's a continuous and endless process rather than a temporary intervention. And I think that's a differentiation that he's made between decolonization and decoloniality. So I am really talking about this continuous process. And it's a continuous process because of the violence, the nature of the violence, the nature of the oppression, the nature of the brutalism that requires that you have to think in the long term and continuously. And I think that question, that issue is very important for us. And one of the questions that has really intrigued me over the past several years is what happens after. I think there is so much a critique of the colonial project and that we we cannot spend too much time continuing to regurgitate this critique, and that's why I call it chat GPTism. But that we really need to invest in thinking about how to move forward. What do you do after? Several years ago, Ben Okri gave a speech at UCT in which he was talking about apartheid as a nightmare and what happens when you wake up from a nightmare. You know, what do you do with a nightmare, and what do you do with the experience, and how do you understand and how do you interpret that nightmare? And that is the question that is intriguing me. And how do you wake up from this nightmare of colonization, of coloniality? And coloniality or colonization in many different forms. And here we are talking about epistemic coloniality, epistemic oppression. We have seen what happens, you know, in oppressive systems. We've seen in the continent what happens when autocratic governments stay for long periods, you know, and the kinds of violence and the kinds of disruptions that happen after that. So we have to ask what happens after an autocratic and oppressive epistemic system remains for a very long period. So if we apply the same analysis, you know, to the states, we should be able to apply the same analysis, you know, to epistemologies, you know, to science, and also, you know, to knowledge production. So that's the question that I'm trying to deal with here. The provocation that I'm trying to push, asking us to move a little a step forward in trying to understand how we live after that. I see decolonization or decoloniality as an attempt to take humanity to a more dignified space. You know, I don't see decoloniality as a provincializing concept that only applies, you know, to a particular geographic location or to a particular phenotype. That decoloniality, just like feminist work, just like critique about disability, just like the critique about LGBTQ, I guess is to take us to a more dignified place, a more convivial a space where we can begin to think together as a collective, but that unique experience, the experience of violence, experience of violation, the experience of exclusion, allows us to think about other ways, you know, to other terms of recognition, you know, to use a concept from Judith Butler. So how do we create new terms of recognition? You know, how do we create new circuits of value, to use a concept from the Nigerian literary scholar Harry Garuba, who argues that the way we need to think about moving forward is to create new circuits of value, because we have lots of epistemologies, lots of ideas, lots of constructs or concepts that are not necessarily bad, but they come from different circuits of value. And that is also why when we apply a literal translation or a literal transmission, we actually place them in different circuits of value. And I think SDGs is one of those. And not that SDGs are not important. I think that the question of human dignity is really critical, and that we have to address poverty and lots of other things. But as I was talking with my elder Carlos Lopez earlier, that you cannot have an entire continent whose only existence is to meet up 167 development goals. You know, there is no time, there's no patience. You cannot have states, universities, local councils, chiefs who move from one goal to the other. One morning it is MDGs, the next morning it is SDGs, you know, so they're constantly chasing, and no patience and no time, you know, to be able to build themselves. Again, I'm not saying that SDGs are not important, but it cannot be the sole purpose of our existence. And this question about decolonial personhood is thinking about that. So how do we think about a new kind of being, you know, after the brutalism, after the violation? And here I want to borrow from several, I think, scholars and thinkers who have provided answers. I think the answer's already there. This question is not new, you know, whether you start from Aimé Césaire and his critique of the Communist Party in France, or you move to Senghor and his attempt to provide us, you know, with a framework, or you get to Mudimbe and his idea, his critique about the colonial library. You know, we have lots of different options that have been offered. It's just that when we spend time trying to meet up 167 SDGs, we don't have the patience to begin to think, you know, how we build, you know, a new personhood, you know, a new kind of being that we can export, you know, into the world. I would like to say I'm a student of so many different people because where I come from, personhood is constantly shifting and is malleable. I think Francis Nyamjo has written about flexible personhood and the importance of taking incompleteness as a framework, you know, to imagine our way forward. So where I come from, you're born one person, you grow up another person, and you die another person. So life is really continuous and constantly shifting. And here, what I want to emphasize is, I think, all debate between the Cartesian subject and another kind of subject, another kind of person. I think the post-colonial subject and the problems with the post-colonial subject is this entrapment in Cartesian logic. And what we need to do is to take it out of Cartesian logic. But it needs a lot of work because especially when you live in European society, you need to be a predictable person. Without predictability, Europe collapses. You know, I call it customary surprises. The problem of customary surprises. So, if you're going to make a birthday gift, you must make sure that it's a birthday gift that the person is going to accept, you know. So you spend so much time trying to understand from their friends, from their families, from lots of other people what they want, so that when you give them a surprise, it's not a surprise, you know. So, and I think that is a challenge, that we have to get out of these customary surprises. We have to get to a kind of a space where you know, we deal with people who are unpredictable and constantly shifting. You know, and I think when we look at the trajectory and evolution of personhood in particular places, I like to talk about where I come from. I think it really gives us really insights to try and experiment on this, and it's not just with us. I mean, I was excited or charmed by the recent coronation in this country. But it's fascinating that somebody can be born Williams, become a Prince of Wales, and then become Earl of something else, and then the next thing something else, a king. You know, which means that the framework actually exists, but it's only privilege that a few can have access to. But of course, it's problematic because when you start applying this framework in the health space, you apply this framework in governance, you apply this framework in many other spaces, there's a big challenge. So thinking about a subject that is outside of the Cartesian subject, a personhood that is flexible, a personhood that considers itself as incomplete and borrowing from others, means that we're pushing people, pushing scholars, pushing thinkers to think outside of the box. It would mean rethinking things like artificial intelligence and the way in which it's dependent on predictable beings and subjects, because you pre-exist yourself. So things that you really cannot measure, you know. And I think this is the future of this decolonial project, and responding to lots of questions that have been asked before. Kizerbo argues, the Burkinabe scholar, in his book La natte des autres, dormir sur la natte des autres, c'est comme si on dormait par terre. So if you sleep on the mats of others, it's as if you're sleeping on the ground. a few years back, the book on translation with Diawara, Mankamo, and others. I think Mankamo has argued that we need to find conceptual vocabularies that make our experiences intelligible on the continent. And this push for a decolonial personhood who is disembedded, a personhood who is not predictable, a personhood who is malleable, a personhood who is not measurable, a personhood who comes out of frameworks of predictable surprises, is really to find the scientific conceptual vocabularies that make our experiences intelligible. So, because translation is a problem. When you translate science, it's a problem. That's also why when Judy argues that the question of the environment is something that Africa has not engaged. On the one side, it's true, but you have to ask what environment, and what is meant by the environment. Many years ago, I worked in the conservation sector, and we had been sent to do work resettling communities outside of a forest in Cameroon. And after spending months and months, we recommended to these organizations that it was important to leave these people in the forest because actually they were living in tune with nature. And what you're actually doing is taking them and putting them in a place where they have to be aspiring to the tenets of enlightenment, which would force them to then return to the same forest in order to survive, to do their roof. They didn't listen. And when I hear the debates today about the Anthropocene, had we tacked on to local other conceptual vocabularies and to try to understand the experiences, make them intelligible, it would have been very different, and we would have learned from that. So I'll end by saying that a friend of mine likes to tell the story of a grandma who always goes around dancing other people's dances. So when she gets into a party, she says, "Oh, Anne danced like this," she dances. Then after that, she says, "David danced like this," and then she dances. But she could dance everyone's dance except her own dance. Nobody ever knew how she could dance. And I think that's the challenge of the continent. We have to be able to find our own dance and dance our own dance and not spend time trying to talk about other people's dances. Yeah. Thank you.